Don't you want a president who's going to end the corruption at the federal agencies, at FDA?
In a closed-door staff meeting this month, Secretary Kennedy called the FDA a sock puppet, echoing his claim that the agency's been captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate.
Look, these are the companies that gave us the opioid epidemic. They pressured FDA to lie, and they got their way.
A report in Bloomberg Business Week examines how the FDA violated its own rules in greenlighting broad marketing of opioid painkillers, sparking the epidemic, leading to years of litigation, and ending in Purdue Pharma's $7.4 billion bankruptcy plan. Dr. Andrew Kolodny of Brandeis University is medical director for the Opioid Policy Research Collaborative.
If you think about FDA's failure with regard to opioids, it's probably the worst regulatory failure leading to a public health catastrophe in history.
Since 1999, opioid overdoses have claimed over 800,000 American lives. Fentanyl makes headlines now, but the addiction crisis began when FDA approvals led the way to aggressive prescribing for chronic pain. Patients still pay the price. 1 in 32 on long-term high-dose opioids loses their life within 2.5 years, and nearly 5 million are addicted, many just following the doctor's orders. Estimates of economic loss rise to $2.7 trillion in 2023 alone.
The FDA, if it had been following the law, it would have required Purdue to demonstrate that OxyContin was safe and effective for long-term use. Unfortunately, it never did that, and it allowed Purdue Pharma to promote OxyContin for conditions where opioids are more likely to harm a patient than help them.
Could it happen again?
It absolutely can happen again, and it's been happening. We're seeing FDA put products onto the market despite the concerns of FDA's own external advisory committees that products are not necessarily effective or safe for the conditions that they're being marketed.
The opioid crisis may be the most well-known case of regulatory failure in pharmaceuticals, but it's not the only one. Controversy has followed a wave of costly new therapies, including treatments for genetic diseases, cancer, and Alzheimer's.
Because we haven't tried to study or learn from this mistake, we're ready for the next public health crisis to result from improper marketing of a drug that's not safe and effective.
To understand how we got here, it helps to look at the climate at the FDA in the 1980s, a time when AIDS activists and palliative care doctors began pushing for faster drug approvals.
We are simply asking the FDA to do it quicker.
In the fight for the FDA to release all possible treatments.
Frank Vacci reviewed opioid applications at the FDA back then, including Purdue's first new opioid, MS-Contin.
People are going to be on this drug for some time, basically until they died.
He says Purdue exploited that political moment, bypassing FDA directives and launching their opioid without submitting clinical data.
When the company came in and told us what they had done, that they actually marketed this product, I was shocked. I was actually startled. There is a pathway to do this, and they completely ignored it. And they ignored it with a certain amount of arrogance also. I mean, they actually told us they weren't going to take the drug off the market. To take the product off the market, which the FDA could have done, would have made FDA the bad guy here, that they're essentially denying pain control to people who are dying. They had the FDA over a barrel.
Emotion trumped standards, and the firm persuaded the agency to defer its plans for action on humanitarian grounds. Purdue was permitted to make a late application for what it was already doing. That late application was exceedingly weak.
There was nothing in there that actually substantiated the duration of effectiveness.
The usual regulatory and scientific requirements need not apply.
I thought the MS-Contin issue set a bad precedent, frankly, that companies could then do very little or nothing at all and then market an opioid products. Once precedent is set, then you have a hard time reversing it.
The next opioid on Vacci's desk, a fentanyl patch called Duragesic, was rejected under the standard. The studies failed, but higher-ups created a new fast-track division and sent the application to a reviewer named Curtis Wright, who approved it. Richard Doblin, president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, got to know Wright in the 1990s.
And what I got to understand about Curtis is that he was, when I worked with him, very focused on unmet medical need, and that he was not as focused on all of the bureaucratic niceties, you could say, that the law required for these two double-blind, placebo-controlled studies to approve drugs.
At the time, Doblin was researching the division, called the Pilot Drug Evaluation Staff, for his Harvard doctorate, interviewing officials and spending time inside the agency. He says Wright was handed a, quote, license to kill bureaucracy.
So he was a bit of a maverick, a bit of a cowboy, and so he was willing to move things forward through the FDA regulatory system in ways that some of the old guard were not that happy with. And some of those decisions turned into disasters. What he did with opiates was a bit reckless, this was this experiment to try to see what would be the outcomes if they remove layers of review.
In a pledge to both chronic pain patients and the drug industry, Wright told a conference in 1993 his narcotics team would do everything that is humanly possible to make it as easy as possible to get these products to market. He was already working with Purdue on OxyContin.
And one of the things that Pilot Drug also did that Curtis Wright was really instrumental with is having a different perspective on who the pharmaceutical companies were. Instead of seeing them as the enemy and that we don't trust them and they're trying to get drugs through just so they can make money, and we need to put up all these obstacles and all these rigorous data gathering things that they have to do, one of the key innovations, I would say, that has lasted, that Pilot Drug put into place, was to see a partnership between the regulators and the industry.
Purdue worked closely with Wright, according to a Justice Department investigation. The drug maker behind OxyContin rented a room nearby and spent days helping him write reviews of the clinical study reports and the integrated summaries of efficacy and safety. Meanwhile, the old guard at FDA had been raising concerns. They said the pilot division lacked objectivity, ignored regulations, and wasn't scientifically rigorous. The agency shut down the division, but OxyContin was already moving toward approval. A year after Wright left the FDA, Purdue hired him.
The opioid epidemic happened because the Food and Drug Administration dropped the regulatory standards necessary to approve drugs. And with that, put opioids on the market labeled for chronic high dose when they were never effective.
Edwin Thompson is president of PMRS, a drug manufacturer based outside Philadelphia.
Whether a drug's effective or not isn't a matter of opinion. It is a matter of data. And if you don't have substantial evidence of efficacy, if you don't have adequate and well-controlled trials with statistical evidence, the drug's not effective. It's just that simple.
Thompson began his career in opioids at Johnson & Johnson back in the 1970s. In the 90s, he dealt with the FDA's pilot drug division, where, he says, he first saw politics start to outweigh science. In his view, it happened with OxyContin and is still happening today.
There are patient populations and diseases that are unsuitably treated, without question. We all accept that. But approving and labeling drugs as being effective for that patient population, when there's no data to support it, there's no substantial evidence of efficacy to support it, does more harm than good. It's really wrong. And you can see the consequences. The harm of this epidemic over 30 years is overwhelming.
The greatest epidemic that America has ever seen.
Is the basic problem that we have at the FDA the law, what the law says, or how the law is being enforced?
The problem is how the law is being enforced. We have a good law. The failure here was not a failure of the law. The law is good. The law requires well-controlled trials that demonstrate safety and efficacy. The problem here was that the FDA did not enforce that law.
The system works. It doesn't have to be bureaucratic, but it's got to be applied, and it's got to be applied scientifically and without bias, and it has to be applied with real methodology as well. And so there were a number of breakdowns in the opioid approval process, starting back with MS Cotton and how the drug ever got approved and when it shouldn't have, right on up to OxyContin and even immediate release oxycodone. Those approvals defy explanation at the FDA. They're just a series of compounded mistakes on compounded mistakes, and there was no one to be able to step in and to stop them from going forward, and certainly to reverse them as well. And so where we are today is we haven't made any progress in stopping the opioid epidemic, and we've not made any progress in stopping to approve ineffective drugs at the Food and Drug Administration.
Thompson believes that the continuing FDA mistakes lead to a cost, not only in drugs and treatments being approved that should not be, but also in what it does to discourage real innovation.
So when you have ineffective drugs being approved, you have a political environment taking place instead of a scientific environment. The scientific environment, the scientific risk, we can manage. We understand very clearly the scientific risk and how to evaluate it. But when you compound them with political risk that we can't measure, then you thwart drug development, you thwart innovation, you significantly put it in the hands of very few people who can even play that game.
Make America healthy again.
So, if HHS Secretary Kennedy wants to address the problem he sees in the FDA being too beholden to pharmaceutical companies, perhaps his first action should be going back to make sure it's following the rules and regulations that are already on the books.
The Food and Drug Administration needs to go back and use the original statutes that Congress put in place for them. They need to use their own regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations, which they wrote but don't practice, and apply them to drug development. If the Food and Drug Administration would follow them, you would see a significant increase in innovative new drugs. You would see a significant reduction in time available for those drugs, and you would see a dramatic reduction in cost of those drugs as well.